Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Music and Politics, the only fusion show on the internet where we listen to music and think philosophically about politics. Every episode we turn to music to listen and analyze as a dimension of politics, to music as a political text, from tone poems to tropicalia, from gospel to grunge, and opera to hip-hop. From Thailand to Tallinn, from Soweto to Surabaya, and from Mumbai to Mobile, we traverse the world. And we guarantee, before you leave us today, you will have your eardrums a-tingle and your brain cells a-quiver with something new and unexpected you won't forget anytime soon. And please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, and to support us on Patreon at Music and Politics Pod, one word. Any help at all is so very appreciated. It will keep us going, and in return, we pledge our personal attention and support to you in your learning. Happy and bold listening ahead.
Welcome back, dear listeners of Music and Politics, and thank you for joining us as we conclude our time with Dr. Lawrence Mass on Wagnerism, addiction, anti-Semitism, a musical life. Before we get to the final part of our interview with Dr. Mass, I thought I would share with you a published interview in the music magazine Van that I conducted with Dr. Mass a couple of years back that I think serves as a great introduction and as a great conclusion to this two-part series with Dr. Mass. So we begin. Lawrence D. Mass, MD, is a retired specialist in addiction medicine and a co-founder of Gay Men's Health Crisis, the first person to write about AIDS in the U.S. press. He is the author of Homosexuality and Sexuality, Dialogues of the Sexual Revolution, Volume 1, and Homosexuality as Behavior and Identity, Dialogues of the Sexual Revolution, Volume 2. He is also the author-editor of an anthology, We Must Love One Another or Die, The Life and Legacies of Larry Kramer, and the author of a memoir, Confessions of a Jewish Wagnerite, Being Gay and Jewish in America. The sequel to that memoir is the collection On the Future of Wagnerism, Art, Intoxication, Addiction, Codependence, and Recovery. And as mentioned in our last segment with Dr. Mass, he is currently concluding a volume 3 of this three-part series on Wagnerism. And Mass has long brought into dialogue his specialization in addiction medicine with gay rights activism and a decades-long practice of musical listening, especially to the operas of Richard Wagner. So we talked about how and why addiction serves as a helpful lens for understanding Wagner and what it means for the musical world to come to terms with his legacy. Much of your work has involved using the language of addiction medicine to make sense of music, especially Wagner. When and how, in your own musical listening, did this approach emerge? Lawrence D. Mass. Addiction medicine is a relatively new field, a brand new specialty. It used to be managed by psychiatry, which didn't want it, though there is a subspecialty, addiction psychiatry. Addiction is a paradigm and perspective that we are continually learning more about, and that will prove increasingly applicable in the worlds of opera, music, and culture. Common addiction terms such as intoxication and bewitchment were also common in the world of Wagner and Wagnerism. In common vocabulary and parlance, Wagnerites will acknowledge this more than you would find in other musics. There is no comparable term like Wagnerism for any other composer, an idea like a cult. The cult of Wagnerism simply has no precedent in scope and power. There isn't anything else in all of classical music culture comparable to it, in view of which the havoc it wrought is not so surprising. nor should its potential to do so again seem so unlikely as the current global turn to authoritarianism gains momentum. I wondered about being an addict to Wagner when I considered myself a Wagnerite. At the time, I started attending recovery. While in medical training, I had an increasing amount of Wagner memorabilia in my environment. I was overwhelmed and seduced by sensual experiences that occupied more and more space. This is what we call, quote, progression. As with alcoholism, where there is a gain in momentum and strength. This period in the early 1980s coincided with the AIDS epidemic and gay activism, while I began to practice as an anesthesiologist in community medicine. At the time, I met and fell in love with professor, author, activist Arnie Kantorovich, a pioneering figure in gay liberation. I brought him back to my apartment, and there were 5 pictures of Wagner on the wall. He asked me, quote, "How come you don't have a picture of Anita Bryant?" She was an American popular musical figure who became an anti-LGBTQ crusader. That got the ball rolling. I realized there was something strange about being such an intense Wagnerite. Question: how do you see Wagnerites behaving like addicts? Why is the notion of addiction helpful for understanding the hold Wagner has on people, rather than less clinical terms such as intoxication and bewitchment? Answer: we use addiction rather casually. I'm a shopaholic. I'm addicted to television. This is common terminology. There is even a magazine called Opera Fanatic. It seems like a normal descriptor rather than something pathological. It's descriptive of eccentricity. Clinically, addiction would imply that it interferes with lives, denies personal milestones and family obligations. Addiction interferes with balance and self-awareness. Wagnerites surrender to the experience and do not stop to take stock. Like Parsifal in Klingsor's garden, they are diverted to an extent they are not aware of and are more endangered than they realize. In addiction, you stop paying attention to things you should be more sensitive to. I saw Parsifal in Wieland Wagner's Last Year at Bayreuth in 1966. Walking around the grounds, I saw the Breaker busts from the Nazi court sculptor, and I felt like I was the only person talking about the busts. It is a symptom of intoxication and addiction when one is opiated by the whole experience. Pertinent questions do not get asked. Question: Stravinsky once wrote that Wagner inflicted, quote, a terrible blow upon music itself, and that his, quote, system never ceased to undermine and finally debase it in the most paradoxical fashion. Do you agree? Answer: there is so much craziness and ridiculousness and inconsistency in Wagnerism. Can you imagine if you were interviewing Wagner right now about his theories and writings and asked him whether his theories were in his work? And he would respond with, quote, "What I feel most deeply is not in my work." Can you imagine him saying that? Being opiated by the great works of Wagner leads to thinking ridiculous and contradictory things. If we take Kundry, the most extreme toxic anti-Semitic stereotype in a work of high art, this satanic demonization of committing the worst sin, of laughing at Christ on the cross. This also doesn't get talked about in more general non-academic circles. The discourse is not rational and can't be trusted. One must look beyond the surface. Question: how did your involvement with gay rights activism in the era of AIDS influence your attitudes towards Wagner and musical listening practices more generally? Answer: I began to look at those around me in the worlds of opera and Wagner. I became more interested in critical platforms. For instance, I began to question James Levine, who never talked about being gay and Jewish. He was the longtime conductor of the Metropolitan Opera. My love affair with Wagner was getting old, and I stopped going to the opera as regularly. I lost interest in the performance value in evaluating singers, and instead focused on what these operas were all about and what was actually going on in the text. At that time, we were really besieged and beleaguered by homophobia from every conceivable standpoint. There were no civil liberties, neither recognition nor respect. The closet was a real aspect. There were many prominent, outstanding stars. None would come out because of the risk. They were not willing to be counted among us. In his book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, critic Alex Ross posits a kind of generic love ideal at the center of Wagner. You see something darker. Answer. When one rationalizes and dilutes, you lose the perspective of toxicity. There is a search for equipoise, for equal players, where it is not clear who are the heroes and who the villains. Can you imagine how diluted that is? Where somehow Alberich is not the arch villain undoing the whole world and the universe? And then basically anyone can find any place and space at all in Wagner, even turning the ring into an immigrant allegory. With Hundig, as it's displayed in a recent production of The Valkyrie by Stefan Herheim. I find that it is Wagnerites wanting to get past all of this, where they do not have these discussions. They want to have their Colosseum to appreciate it without having to bother their conscience about slavery and brutality. They are impatient to get out of what Ross called the Nazi rut. It's almost as if the onus to do the forgiveness is on the Jews. The whole immediate Wagner family were war criminals, given light wrist taps. Let's remember the 30,000 murdered in Flossenburg, the concentration camp that had a satellite forced labor camp at Bayreuth, where Wieland served as deputy civilian leader, as Gottfried Wagner has so well reminded us of. Even Barry Kosky, who was outspoken and articulate about a love-hate relationship with Wagner, and who has made rich and indicting productions, one can still imagine that if he truly committed, there is a way to change the repertoire more. However critical, however stinging and indicting some of his work, his star turned Meistersinger, and likewise Yuval Sharon's Lohengrin, remain overarchingly in the service of preserving the status quo of Wagner in Germany, at Bayreuth, and in the wider worlds of opera. Directors remain grateful to Bayreuth, legitimizing the status quo, even if their output is critical and laudable. The bottom line on Wagnerites is that they remain intoxicated. I think Wagner would be thrilled to find Jews are still endlessly arguing about him and his legacy, still enthralled no matter how much we protest. If we're really cured of the disease of Wagnerism, why are we doing all this? Why aren't we finally walking away from it all without looking back? In my own case, it's a story I simply had to tell, but the reason for that may be primarily about addiction, which, as you must know, is not a curable condition. It can be arrested and treated, but not cured. No addict has ever been cured. Question. You have often mentioned the cases of Judy Garland and Maria Callas, towering icons of gay culture, who never spoke out on behalf of gay civil rights. You described how gay audiences and listeners believed they were more significant than ultimately was the case. Arguably, the case of Wagner and Jews is even worse. as he did speak out about Jews on several occasions, but only to attack them. Answer: I think of Wagner now as the first love of my life. I don't know too much detail about Ted Bundy, but apparently he was handsome and charismatic. Once I had awoken to the reality of Wagner, it was like a woman with Ted Bundy, waking up and realizing he was a serial killer. Wagner was very sadistic in picking out these images of Jews, especially those trying to assimilate. It is especially searing in the ring, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. Interview concluded. Thank you for your patience. Please listen to a musical excerpt from a 1942 production stage managed by the Nazi propaganda ministry inside a factory, yes, producing armaments for the ongoing war effort. Bear in mind, 1942 was both the height of the extent of the Nazi Empire and the height of the Holocaust. This is Wilhelm Furtwängler conducting the prelude to Wagner's Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, the Master Singers of Nuremberg. And after that, we will proceed on to the final part of our discussion with Dr. Maas. Fare thee all so well.
What I later had a lot of conflict about, which is that I'm listening to a recording, a live recording from Bayreuth from Nazi Germany,
Wow.
and not having it's just the music and the greatness and the I this was my whole thing that I began to explore as a Jewish Wagnerite.
Mm,
Wagner's very great.
right. No,
Eh,
yeah, sorry.
Wagner is very great, and that everybody concedes that, and I concede that, and there's no sort of, but what does it mean to just ignore all these other feelings? And there's lots of comebacks to that. Well, other people who were not Jewish lost people in the war, and I mean, all kinds of, it's not as if Jews are the only person who would have feelings of conflict. But my friend who introduced me to Wagner, we became Wagnerites instantly. And within a year, we were buying these old historic recordings, some of them live from Nazi Germany. And we would just fall in love with these singers. They were fabulous. And then eventually we started, well, this one turns out Laura Lehmann was a favorite. She was heroic, and she left Germany and all that, but most of the rest of them did not. They had their various forms of collusion. And for many, many years, I just didn't look at this stuff. Bought I just bought the whole package of Bad Man, Great Art. And you say something about the Bad Man up front, and as long as you were not a Nazi, you could all kind of just
Mm,
be on the same page. Also, a way of kind of assimilating. It's sort of um, like women being part of very sexist social situations where they get along fine and they have good friends there and everything. They don't want to rock that boat. But the bigger, I don't know what the example would be, but or blacks. I mean, in white situations where there's a lot of racism ambient, and but it's their world. You see some versions of this in the gay world where
mm,
what you have in common is that you're gay. And that turns out to be a pretty strong bond, so that you can have a black person in a completely white milieu of gay people, and he's one of us. I
yeah,
mean,
right.
he belongs just to the same extent that we do, and we're all the same family, and nobody's questioning at any level, including him,
Mm.
or me. So,
I mean, it's notable. That's another case, I think, where it's highly relevant today. The issue is artistic, either penalty, let's say, or political segregation or even repression. I mean, we take the example of the Russian stars at the Metropolitan Opera with Putin's Russia, and it came up in the play the early post-war protests against Karajan and Fort Wrangler when they came to New York, and Karajan kind of accuses Bernstein, "Oh, you were behind it,"
yeah.
and that question of like, should audiences protest performers at concert halls, even, and to what extent do we allow politics there into the concert hall in terms of associations, bearing in mind, right, that these musical infrastructures are very tied to power and funding and government. So we discussed that with
Well,
Russia too.
what I've had to learn the hard way is to simplify it is this thing that we're talking about is when it comes to these things, art always wins. It just does. I mean, it can bide its time, and it can seem very unjust and really distressing and uh, painful, but if the art is really great, it's going to, be continue to be appreciated. It's great. I mean, there are some very great artists who, were appropriately censured and are appropriately relegated. I think questions about Wagner in that sense do arise. I mean, how many ring cycles should, leading opera companies be doing? I mean, choice of repertoire. I mean, these things are kind of still there, but in the end, artistic greatness tends to, dominate the field of all these arguments and discourses, and you know, Wagner, his greatness has been greatly damaged and tarnished by all that's happened historically. But you just can't say he wasn't a great composer. It's just.
Shall we? Maybe we'll
Yeah.
go to one more
Okay.
excerpt,
Okay.
and then perhaps what about? I think you had Fidelio
Yes.
was also
Well, I had
or in terms
Fidelio and Don Giovanni.
Don Giovanni.
Um, uh, well, I was very enamored of John Vickers, who had a sort of beautiful, powerful, honeyed Helden tenor voice. But I mean, I fell in love with Fidelio without realizing why, which is, I think, very interesting. Fidelio is this work of great nobility, of sentiment and character and ideals, and of tyranny over, of triumph of nobility over, and courage over tyranny. And when you're young, you can't fully appreciate all that, but it did register. It registered to me that this was this, absolutely magnificent, great work, even though it's kind of a little troubled as an opera. It's a little clunky and strange, but the I loved it at great depth without fully knowing why. And of course, it was great music and great singers that I was exposed to early on in this, but it was part of my love affair with the art form. So, should I put this on?
Please, and you can share, please, that you actually saw this in 1960 in Chicago.
Yes, this was one of my very first operas, and the cast was incredible. It was Birgit Nielsen, John Vickers, Irmgard Seyfried, Walter Berry, and Hans Hotter. And so it's like a dream cast for any of these Wagner operas. And I think they actually, that season, they did Die Walküre. I think that was another reason all those people, not Irmgard Seyfried, but the others were there. It was really magnificent. So I just put. When was the last time you saw Fidelio?
Good question. It's been a couple of years for sure. I think it was at the Met in the last couple of years.
I feel like I need it the way I need a tonic, like like a medicine. I really in these times, of tyranny, and all this stuff is happening anew. Did you ever see John Vickers? No, you're younger. Well, he really was a magnificent singer. He didn't do that much Wagner, and rightly so. It was just because he had a powerful voice, and he did these Helden tenor parts, but these Wagner parts are absolutely punishing. They are just punishing, and he rightly. I mean, there's a Tristan with him from Aix-en-Provence, and he's just overwhelmed. I love the guy,
Right.
but
It's interesting you make a parallel a little bit with Elvis because it was at the time of Elvis
yeah,
when he was on that.
that's
Yes.
right. Well, he was kind of the Elvis of opera in a way. Well, that no, I think if you're saying the Elvis of opera, you'd be talking about somebody like Pavarotti.
Okay.
But I don't think Vickers was quite in that realm of frenzied popularity. But he was definitely top singer. You have all these preludes and this just incredible story of love and hope and courage and over triumphing over tyranny.
Yes. So you mentioned this is a work that's come back to you, like throughout.
It's a work I often think of with great affection and reverence, and I remember it vividly. And every time it's revived, which isn't that often, it's really not always revived, I seem destined to miss it. This last time I was on the cruise, they just did it at the Met, and so I haven't seen it in many years, and I just ache to see it again. So I think if I ever get my subscription to PBS straightened out, I think I could get the Met broadcast.
Should be able
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
And this is the scene where Fidelio goes into the dungeon.
Right.
Right.
And this is the first time you hear Florestan. Oh, let me show you the translation here. Here it is. That's the refrain. That's you're not.
Right.
This is a kind of introduction to the aria sings. O grauenvolle Stille. He had this
terror of silence. After that terrible silence.
yes, in the dungeon. He had a great mezzo voce that he could sing softly and then also very full. It was a huge voice and just filled up the whole, but he could sing softly also. Ist Gottes Wille. in the spring days of one's life. Gorgeous.
Well, that about does it for us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for tuning in, our dear listeners. Please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, the only show on the internet that combines musical grooves with philosophical insights from all around the world. Please do send any questions, thoughts, comments, and suggestions to musicandpoliticspod@gmail.com. That's one word lowercase, musicandpoliticspod. And please do find us out on Patreon. Again, at Music and Politics Pod, one word lowercase. There you can support us to keep us going to see another day. And in exchange for the cost of an overpriced cup of coffee, we will provide curated readings and playlists from what you have already heard and where you can go next on your own journey into music and politics. Fare thee all so well.